Welcome to you all. Safe distance, global studies, colloquium, no warm lunch is served. We are very happy that Raul, you are joining us, and people also from outside, like Marcus from University Erfurt, is joining us because your work, Raul, is so formidable and well known that it brings in other people. George, thank you very much for connecting us. Would you please introduce Raul for us?
Yeah, thank you, Jan. Well, good morning, good afternoon, everyone, wherever this may find you. Welcome. So first of all, I'd like to start by hoping and hoping that all of you and your loved ones are staying safe and healthy during these times. I'm extremely excited to introduce a camarada and compañero, Raul Zibechi, today to the Global Studies Colloquium. Of course, thanking the department, thanking Brett and Jan for putting this together. So first, for the obligatory, institutional introduction, Raul Zibechi is from Montevideo, Uruguay, a writer, popular educator, journalist who accompanies organizational processes in Latin America, receiving an honorary doctorate from the Universidad Mayor de San Andrés in La Paz, Bolivia in 2017. He's published over 20 books on social movements in which he has criticized the old state-centered political culture. He publishes in various media in the region, among others, La Jornada, Disinform, Rebelión, and Correo da Cidadania. And now for the people's introduction, which I think it's really important to sort of explore this sort of methodology that Raul takes up here. He embodies very much the Latin American praxis of accompanimiento, which is itself a pedagogy that requires a deep methodology of sentir pensar. He's a militant reporter whose militancy is found in the deep commitment to los pueblos. He unapologetically stands alongside those from below. He embodies a positionality that formal institutions of knowledge can view as and I mean this with a great compliment, a corrupted scholarship, given that the measure of an institutional academic is informed by the critical distance between researcher and subject. However, Zibechi defies that standard, writing not at or for movements, but alongside. The Indian historian Ranajit Guha, in writing about counterinsurgency, distinguished between three sorts of sources for the study of subaltern uprisings. And I think Zibechi practices what Guha would call the production of the secondary source, writing from within movements, deploying the Zapatista praxis of caminar preguntando, or to walk while asking questions, as a horizontal practice of interculturalism. But I want to pause here because I think I'd be remiss, and I believe Zibechi would also be the first one to think so, if I continued on with just the individual accomplishments without focusing on the struggles of others, right? So for the similar reasons that drove the well-known figures Subcomandante Marcos' transition into Subcomandante Galeano, our attention should not be drawn to professional accomplishment, but rather to the people. And Raul in this way serves as a vessel, a teacher, educator, reporting on the constellations of other possibilities that are already present around the continent in Latin America. So that brings us to the talk today, which will be speaking on societies and movement across Latin America that have been reanimated as a result of the ongoing global pandemic. Much of the focus has been on the global junctures and the transitional politics that have occurred on the global scale. However, how much more lies beneath these dominant structures of power in Latin America, beyond the cultures of capitalist consumption, security, and violence. Defined by epochs, the current Latin American epoch of Buen Gobierno is coming to a close if it hasn't already. Not because of the rise of the right, but because more and more communities are turning inwards and across, building community in the barrios, in el campo, in los territorios originarios, the original territories. As the Indian writer Arundhati Roy wrote in a short piece published in April, the global pandemic has transformed our current reality, and in many ways opened portals into other worlds. And today, Zibechi leads us through some of those portals opened up by the communities and autonomous resistance, from the Indigenous Peoples Guard of the NASA in Colombia to the popular kitchens in Lima and the barrios of Montevideo. And with that, I'd like to hand over the virtual floor to Raul to start our conversation today. Thank you.
Thanks, George, for your words. Thank Jan, and thank for the department for this invitation to talk with you. Before starting, 3 points. First, the text that I'm going to share with you arises from the reality of Latin America and does not pretend to have more validity than in this part of the world. Second, I am going to read because my English is not fluid, so I hope you understand my presentation. Third, we are living a period of great militarization of our societies in Latin America, with state violence, paramilitary groups, and drug traffickers attacking the populations. Only in Colombia, there were 67 massacres this year, with 263 murdered. This is the map of Latin America. I won't return for this, but I will begin in saying that we are living one of the most painful, most difficult moments for the social movements in Latin America. I think the pandemic and the army repression and the police repression are two things that make that the conjuncture is so difficult for the people organized in movements. Good, I go. We are experiencing unforeseen and unforeseen changes that leave us perplexed and often paralyzed. An immense gale is sweeping over our previous ways of doing, which in just days has dismantled us, leaving us out in open, both individually and collectively. The isolation we suffer here in Latin America movements imposed by the elites is perhaps the most strident symbol of this storm, particularly for those of us who live in cities closed off to sociability, yet remain open to speculation and accumulation through dispossession, like David Harvey explains. During the last months of 2019, there were social outbreaks and uprisings in several countries, among which Chile, Ecuador, Colombia, Haiti, Bolivia, and Nicaragua stand out. Huge mobilization had already taken place in Brazil and Argentina in 2013 and in 2017, respectively. In all cases, neoliberal extractive policies were the central target for collective action, be it on the right or left, conservative or progressive governments. Both are administrating the same economic and political model. Then, in March 2020, when the pandemic led governments to decree quarantine measures, societies in movement remained active, but could no longer continue to occupy squares and avenues, and instead had to trudge new paths forward. During the pandemic, while prevented from demonstrating, popular feminist and indigenous peoples organizations had to modify their forms of actions. They must to modify, but most of them, they don't know in what way, in what path. What follows is an attempt to systematize the experiences of people and movements with whom I have communicated during the pandemic, although I had visited them on several occasions in recent years. I will touch 4 points. First, an inward turn, either in the territories reconquered by los pueblos, peoples in English, by we speak as peoples like village or towns, pueblos, or new rural and urban spaces born due to the pandemic. Occurring spontaneously, many communities decided to block the entry and exit of people in the respective territories, as the Zapatistas have done in Chiapas. Establishing controls that delimit the territory is a way of ordering and protecting at the same time, since it is driven by a clear awareness that the disease comes from the outside and that it's their own resources that can best deal with it. In addition to the closure Of the 43 Zapatista spaces, the half, more or less half of them are new spaces. The most diverse communities intensified territorial control, most notably by the NASA Indigenous Guard in the Colombian Cauca. Here in Cauca, 7,000 guards using ceremonial batons control 70 points, ensuring that only vehicles and people authorized by the councils are the authorities of the NASA territories, can enter. Then the Cauca Regional Indigenous Council decided to implement Minga Hacia Adentro, inward community work, which can be read as a synthesis of what both rural and urban towns are doing throughout Latin America. The notion of turning inward is the strengthening of community relations that crosses both material and symbolic dimensions, ranging from greater food autonomy to the strengthening of internal authorities rooted in the practices of decision-making in assembly and by consensus. Collective harmonization is done through rituals in sacred places such as lagoons, communal kitchens, and incense burners through the guidance of traditional doctors. Unlike the hegemonic system, which seeks out social consensus by constructing an external enemy, societies and movements do so by actualizing ancestral rituals that harmonize people, human and non-human collectives, mountains, lagoons, plants, and animals. While the first is a logic of homogeneity for and by the war, the second is based on the care and reproduction of life. I think care is very important in this moment for the indigenous and the Black communities in Latin America, and also the peripheries from the cities. These territorial closures should not be interpreted as self-imposed isolation. It's a little bit isolation, but not a completely isolation, but rather the demarcation of a frontier, one that leads to the strengthening of non-capitalist relations. I will speak a little bit more about this in the last part. Putting use values before exchange values, solidarity and fraternity among those from below against a culture of individualism that proposes and imposes the dominant system. It is the reason why we see the stay-at-home proposal replaced by the stay in the neighborhood in the Argentinian villages, or the stay in community of peasants and native and Black peoples. They think in community, in groups, in families, not in individuals. In sum, against the impossible individuality of the middle classes, a collectivization of the public space arises, which is nothing but the extension of the habitual practices of the popular sectors in the face of a global pandemic. This reality opened us up to two still incipient debates. One, the role of collective works, mingas or tequios, in the creation of other worlds, and second, the way of approaching care, not in a state, institutional, and individual way, but collectively and in community. I think the community care is very different as the state care. Because it's not individualized, it's not for a person, for a citizen, it's in collective, made from the collective, from the community to the community. And then the curse changes because the subject of the care is not the state, is the community. Second point, the siege for food autonomy. In all the registered experiences, a return to the land remains constant, including in the urban peripheries where this task is much more complex. For these spaces, food autonomy constitutes not only an attempt to overcome the economic consequences of the pandemic, but also a desire to do so collectively, breaking the imposed isolation of the individual-family dichotomy. A hunger for land, I say hunger for land, you understand me, and territory has grown among the urban popular sectors, native peoples, blacks and peasants during the pandemic. A testament for this trend, to this trend, is the multiplicity of urban initiatives that can be observed. In Chile, for example, 200 territorial assemblies formed in the middle of the outbreak last year. And now 500 collective kitchens or pots, I don't know is collective kitchen or collective pots, in Santiago, only in the city Santiago, which in the middle of the pandemic set up supply networks outside of the market, contacting producers directly. In the urban peripheries, in Temuco, Chile, in Popayán, Colombia, in Córdoba, Argentina, here in Montevideo, where I live, thousands of people occupied land to build houses or to cultivate, or both, in what is a direct challenge to private property and the state. For example, in Argentina, in July, last July, in a very cold and rainy winter, 10,000 persons, more or less 2,000 families, occupied 100 hectares in the south periphery from Buenos Aires, the greatest occupation in the large history of occupations of land in Argentina. For me, it is evident that in rural areas, food autonomy, I will explain. For me, food autonomy is a concept that I prefer to that of food sovereignty, which is always linked to the state. No? And in rural areas, food autonomy has greater scope and a long and fruitful history. Taken up with the greatest vigor, it is the indigenous movement which remain steadfast in their defense of the land. Similarly, many peasants have blocked the entry of their pueblos, towns, villages throughout Latin America to ensure that the virus does not enter the communities. For several decades now, there has been dialogue between territories and an autonomous self-government, whose actualization has a new sense of urgency in this moment, particularly in the cities and in the urban peripheries. For this reason, it is important to look at what is taking place in the communities. For example, Charan, a self-government city of 20,000 inhabitants in Michoacán, Mexico, or the neighborhood self-management that the 8 communities of the popular organization Francisco Villa in Mexico City are testing, or the territorial assemblies in Santiago and Valparaíso in Chile, as in other cities around the world. I believe that urban experiences, no matter how small, are very important because they are rare, and most of the planet's population lives now in cities. For me, this is a challenge for the future for the social movement. Third, the links between those from below, rural-urban as an opening to autonomy. Neither cities are food and water autonomous, nor are rural areas autonomous in health and in the development of technology. Sharing common interests, the popular sectors that inhabit the urban peripheries and organized workers at the center need one another, given that they cannot save themselves. The support provided by the, for example, Uruguayan unions to the communal kitchen in the peripheral neighborhoods, food donations from rural producers to urban inhabitants, are just a sample of how links between the rural and urban poor are being strengthened during the pandemic. Perhaps the most striking and impressive action for me in terms of solidarity is that of the Bañados, Asunción, Paraguay. Dozens of communal kitchens work under the motto, "The state does not take care of us, the poor cares of the poor," in a broad solidarity work that connects students and professionals with organized inhabitants who live in extreme poverty. The support between the settlement of the landless movement of Brazil and the urban poor, sending tons of food, thousands of tons of food, just as the exchange of products between NASA people from the countryside and the city, and are an excellent example of mutual aid between pueblos. Centuries of capitalist domination have segmented and fragmented peoples, particularly with regards to their knowledge and potential. It is thus imperative that communities rebuild as peoples to recover lost or ancestral knowledges. A good example of knowledge recovery is the return of hueseras, born doctors in Occidental words, a praxis that was disappearing throughout the Zapatista territory. Fourth, boost the world of use values. The proliferation of barter fairs and other ancestral practices outside the capitalist system or capitalist market is present among the peasant and indigenous populations of Bolivia, Colombia, Mexico, Guatemala, and other countries. Barter fairs are set up at previously agreed points and days, without currency, not for the exchange of equivalents, but exchanges carried out based on need. These are historical practices, but which in the midst of the health emergency acquire a double sense of collective resistance and as well as becoming an alternative to capitalism. Urban agriculture is beginning to experiment with circular gardens, which draws upon an ancestral indigenous logic, linked on the one hand to their own worldviews and on the other to water conservation, crop diversification, and the division of labor based on mutual aid. In some cities, community-based care practices are set up, identifying the most vulnerable population to supply them with food without having to leave their homes. Some supply networks have made it possible for families in the cities to not have to rely on supermarkets, but buy directly from rural producers who participate in the networks. Small-scale banks are also proliferating, which arrange modes of community savings and redistribution to the families with the most urgent needs. In short, non-capitalist practices premised on dispersion and not on the concentration of goods from the production and distribution of use values prevents them from becoming reliant on exchange values. The non-capitalist economy surfaces during the pandemic, multiplying possibilities that until now seemed only marginal. In these experiences, we find heterogeneous social and collective practices with respect to the hegemonic ones that are not defined by their small scale, local, and even marginal condition. The expansion of these practices is along an uncertain path, which cannot be shortened by following into the networks of the capitalist system or the state. It is important to be aware of these collective practices because when people need them, they adopt and multiply them. Good. Now I will play a PowerPoint to explain a little bit this these bars. There, you can see, it's okay. I will explain a little bit what is this Minga in word. You know, Minga is collective or community work. People uses, indigenous people uses Minga for many things, for many works, for cultivate the land, for the community, not only for the families, to build a house, the Minga, the people Minga, the town Minga can help the family, or to help a family who has a disease or a great problem, a sanitary problem, they can make Minga to buy medicaments or anything. But Minga has also another significance. For example, Minga is a collective mobilization, mostly in Colombia, but not only in Colombia, is when the people, when the towns, the peoples go out of the territory and then goes to the government in the big cities to demand some things. The Regional Indigenous Council of CAUCA has 8 of the 9 peoples from the CAUCA. CAUCA is a department in South Colombia, inhabited by 1 million persons, and 200,000 from there are indigenous, mostly Nasas, but not only. And then last week, now they are here in Colombia, where the A is in 500 kilometers north of CAUCA, the red department. They are walking and going in cars. Chivas is the name, to demand not money, not rights. They demand only life, to stop the massacres. This is the Indigenous Guard. The Indigenous Guard is integrated by families, men and women. Some coordinators of the Guard are women. And this stick, the baton, the ancestral baton named Chonta, is a ceremonial baton. It's the only arm they have to defend. They don't use the baton as arm, only a symbolic use. They use the baton, and the other can recognize I am a guard. Also, there are children, boys and girls in the guard making a concrete work, because the guard is integrated but by family. In Occident, this is a problem, but we can discuss about this. Guard is only self-defense. They don't attack others. The ceremonial stick. This is a woman leading the guard, an old woman leading the guard. The guard protect the demonstrations out of the territory. And in the territory, when a family has a problem, the man cries or make anything against the woman or the children, you can also speak with the guard. The guard is not a police. When it's a big problem in the families, they discuss with the family, they make education and formation, education with the families, not as policy. The idea in this moment, the harmonization, is these 4 points: returning to the simple life, the normal life in the land, in the nature, homemade food, barter, and community elder care with the traditional doctors. Harmonization of the people in the territory. Misak is one of the 9 peoples in CAUCA. They confront the pandemic combining care with its medicinal plants and harmonizing the people in the communities, people with people and people with the land, with nature. Then they go to the sacred seats, to the lagoons, to the mountains, and make the traditional ceremonies. These are the plants, the medicinal plants. and these are the lagoons where they go to make these rituals, these ceremonies. They go in big groups. I have spoken about this. This, the second phrase, said an ancient man, barter is a political alternative for a time like this. Barter is very traditional. They made normally some barters, but now it's systematic barters in every towns between products from different climates, hot and cold climates, and the need prevails, not the value. For me, that is very important, and they speak about this. We change not 1 kilo for 1 kilo. Normally, yes, but now in the emergency, in the pandemic, they change what they need. I have 10 kilos of bananas and I need 1 kilo of sugar, panela. Well, the needs is the most important thing in this moment. This is a barter in a town. One thing important, barter is not only a material market. They are also art or dances or music performance, because barter is also an interchange from different forms of the everyday life. No, this is very interesting because they are one completely day in this point, and then first they make the material barter, fruits and so vegetables, and after this they sing, they dance and so. Good. Then I will play, if I can, another thing. You can see the this is the Minga, who is now in Bogota. It's only 2 minutes. "8,000 persons going to Bogota with the guard protecting the people, the persons, the families." "250 indigenous leaders murdered in the last years. 231 defenders of life murdered. 67 massacres, youth, mostly youth, youngs. Life moves us. That's why we continue in Minga. Good. This is my presentation. I would explain a little bit more from the NASA and Colombian indigenous movement, because I think it's not so well known as other movements like Zapatistas. And I think this movement is not the only movement in Latin America. We have a lot of experiences in this way. For example, now we have in North Peru, the territorial government from the Wampis Nation, and many of other peoples are going in the same path, in the same direction. Good, I will hear you and we can discuss, or I will respond things or what you want.
Marvelous, Raul. Thank you so much. What a marvelous evocation. Please, floor is open. Who wants to ask, raise questions or comments? Something I want to ask now, Raul. The, the election outcomes in Bolivia. It's a bit out of the subject, but what do you think?
You will speak about Bolivia, Jan. You will that
No.
I speak. Ah.
your your reactions. What do you think? And then Ricardo, please. Um, but that Raul, a point about Bolivia. What's your
Yes,
feeling?
I now.
See, see.
Ah, I'm very happy with the mass triumph. I think it's a good thing because first they stop the racism. The Bolivian right is very terrible. It's violent. Is anti-Indian against the Indians. Is genocide and has a very bad history. And in this way, it's very nice. Second thing, I think we don't return to the first Evo Morales government in 2005. It's a different situation, January 2006. Why? Because the population, the indigenous population in Bolivia has many organizations, many movements. And this movement imposes David Choquehuanca name for the vice presidents. They demanded to Evo, we will Choquehuanca. Choquehuanca is the most important representative of the indigenous population. Is a little bit traditional in the religions link, no? But it's very important for them. And they had made a very interesting work with the Indian communities in Altiplano, Aymaras and Quechuas, mostly Aymaras. And these movements spoke with Evo in the same level, not as people with the leader, no, in the same level. And they said, we need Choquehuanca. Is our friend, is our person. And then Evo, in a negotiation, accepted Choquehuanca as vice president, not as president. And in this moment, a lot of dirigents said, it's not the moment to the Evo return to Bolivia. He will return in the future, but don't now, not now. And Evo has not place in the government. This is a discussion. This is a fight, a silent fight, but really. I speak in this way. Why? Because I think that in this second era, second moment of the mass government, the social organizations has empowered in relation from the government or from the mass. And another thing, this is a little bit with the little words, little lips. Álvaro García Linera, they don't. No one speaks from García Linera in Bolivia. I know very closely. Linera was my friend, and he has a Leninist thought. He is he think like, and he works like Lenin or worse like Stalin, controlling the movements They do two coups against two big movements in Bolivia during the Evo governments in 211 and 12, with the police taking out the really dirigents, the legitimate dirigents, and putting there in his place the government dirigents, the dirigents who are linked to the government. This is very crazy, and the population know this, and they say no. The deviations we will not repeat, and we will. I don't know what is the future, what is passing in the future, but the first step is very nice.
Sí, gracias, Raúl. Ricardo, did you want to comment?
Yeah, I just have a small question. You earlier mentioned the distinction between food autonomy and food sovereignty, and you conclude that food sovereignty is very status. My understanding about the peasant movement is precisely to control production, distribution, and consumption of food. And so I wanted you to explain why are you concluding that it's status. Yeah. My second point is question is related to the indigenous struggle, and how does it relate to other struggles, or you can call it class struggles for lack of a better word, within the different societies. For example, there is a lot of within the eco-socialist movement that are focusing on the indigenous ways of ecology and extrapolating it. So as opposed to an internal focus, there is an extraction for a larger political project. And I'm just trying to, using those three examples, particularly in eco-socialist thought. And what is your views on all of this in terms of, yeah.
Thank you, Ricardo. Now, Jan?
Sí, sí.
Food sovereignty. Good. I appreciate this concept of food sovereignty. They began in the 19th with the landless movement from Brazil and Via Campesina. I defend this concept, this idea, but I see first, my thought is in develop, in permanent, like other thoughts are changing. And now I see that the movements, without state helps, without state care, are working for his own sovereignty, his own autonomy on food. And then it's a provocation. It's not a really concept, no. I prefer to speak in this moment as autonomy, as food autonomy. I don't reject the other concept, but it's so much linked to the state, including the landless movement. They think the food sovereignty as a cooperation between the land workers, the peasants, and the state. But in this moment, the state is out of the discussion. This is a problem for us. And now the landless movements donate more or less 10,000 tons of food to the urban peripheries every month. And this is a very hard work without the state. And then I prefer to speak food autonomy. But it's not anything definitively, it's not anything that rejects, it's not in contradiction with food sovereignty, okay? The second thing, the relationship between indigenous struggle and the other struggles. This is a very good question, Ricardo, and it has not a really response, a really answer response. Yes, I have not idea. I see that some struggles has been incorporated by the indigenous movement. For example, they work with the land without agrochemics, no? They make a really nice ecologist work with the land. They don't speak about ecology, but they do this. Or this is a part. In other parts, some peoples cultivate drugs, coke, and so. Why? Because they need to eat. This is a contradiction, I think, no? For me, it's very interesting how the indigenous movement is incorporating the feminist struggle. And this is a very interesting new situation because the traditional culture is very the masculine, very patriarchal. The traditional Indian culture worldwide is patriarchal. And then a lot of women in black and indigenous people and also peasants are speaking about the women groups and women's struggle. For example, the Zapatistas made the two meetings, big meetings in Morelia with women from all the world. Or the NASA's has commandants, coordinators from the Indigenous Guard, women. I think the first step to make a nice relationship with other struggles is to incorporate the different struggles in the movement, in the self-movement, indigenous movement. And the workers movement now today, 21 of October in Colombia, the unions, the big unions, convocate a paro nacional, a strike, national strike for 1 day. And the Minga Indigena participates together with the unions in the same day from day struggle day, and in the same march together. For me, this is very important. It's most important, this participation, as if the leaders make a photo together. This is not very important. This is nice, but it's not the matter. Then 100 of workers from the construction, from the industry, marching together with the Indians or with the blacks. Oh, that is very nice. That is, for me, a way to vinculate, to relation the different struggles on the street, in the movement, making things. I don't know.
Raul,
Yes, yes.
see, Gustavo has a follow-up question, related question. Gustavo?
Thank you so much, Jan, for organizing. Raul, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us. My question builds a little bit on Ricardo's first question. And I'm more familiar with the way that the landless peasant movement, the MST in Brazil, has been responding to the crisis. And it's very inspiring to hear you, elaborate on the Mingas and the indigenous territoriality of being able to approach the crisis by setting up protections of the community from an outside invasion and infection and building up autonomy. It seems from my understanding of many of these struggles that that is not always a viable option. A goal in which we have abolition of private property and the state, no more class inequality, will also involve abolition of town and country. We would be able to reduce these issues where there would be a distinction of people who are mere consumers and people who are just pure producers of food. But in the meantime, we're living with the challenge of, as you mentioned, highly urbanized societies. And we're not going to be able to, with one crisis, with 1 year, even one generation, to build up food autonomy in all the urban areas in Latin America. So we do face the immediate need of establishing, as you mentioned, whether it's barter networks or other networks for bringing food, both to protect the peasant producers and also to supply the urban working class. In that situation, what I've seen is the inside-outside strategy of the MST in Brazil, where they are autonomous from the government, organize independent territorial and organizational structures, but also recognize that it is beneficial to invest in political power, the local level, even to be able to influence national level politics. With the fascist government in Brazil, we had inability to cope with the pandemic, right, in a structural way. And there are some actions, it seems, public health measures, information about public health, allocation of resources, of medical resources, where the influence on the state seemed to be a useful way to make these ends meet. So whether it is by connecting food supply, whether it is by providing public health measures, contact tracing, testing, therapeutics, eventually, hopefully, to roll out a vaccine, these are actions that seem to require more than just autonomy. And they are actions that are really central to the struggles of movements that don't have the privilege of territorial autonomy. So how do you then suggest that these autonomous struggles, recognizing that they're, we're also going to have to influence, say, inside the state, how can they, play a role? And just a final point I would ask, the assassinations, the murders, the fascist, the rise of fascism, to combat that through mere autonomy, it seems to also leave aside many people who are too vulnerable, too exposed to those fascist attacks. So to a certain extent, like in Bolivia, for example, shouldn't we also be trying to retake the state, knowing that it's going to always be a problematic and partial solution? But isn't there also a need for us to combat fascism at the state? A liberal state is a problematic state, but at least we can have more defense from, massacres and assassinations and so on. How do you help us think through this paradox?
Yes, I agree with you and with your idea that we can't make a struggle autonomy territories against state, because this is crazy, this failed, and the history said this can't be with a good history, with a good final. I don't said, but when the landless movement in Brazil donate food to the peripheries, they also are helping these people to organize, to make his own organizations and to make some influence in the cities. I think it's very interesting this, because the landless movement make alliances. I think that the idea of alliance, what is, I am in my autonomy territory. Here I live, here is my empowerment, but I make alliances with others. This other can be unions, churches, and so, but also with the state. But the state is not a thing. They choose to do first alliance with municipes, with towns, with villages, with the authorities of these villages. I know some settlements in Brazil that vender, how do you say vender? Exchange? No.
Buy?
Sell. Vender, sell.
Sell, okay, thank you. Sell the product or the production of the settlement to the municipality of this town. This is very nice, because the production, the food production of the landless is very nice without agrochemics. And then they make a point with this authority of the village, of the town, or little cities, or biggest cities. Also with the universities, they have a lot of shares of relations with universities. Then the children from the settlements go to the universities and make 10 years studying and then return as specialists in animals, in veterinarian or so. There are alliances not with the state like a ball, a big ball, with part of the state. Universities, municipal, local governments are part of the state. Then or the NASA in Colombia, they go to the elections. They have deputies and senators. They have they support some parties, indigenous parties or popular parties. And then for me, the idea is not not autonomy territories against. Also, is not to submit the autonomy to the state. Is make a dance, like a dance, no, like a movement. I see. I play. I say our autonomies are like arcs, like boats. When the wind come against us, we are in problems. But when the wind come with us, then we are going better. This is the thing. If I have a good government, a left government, or a good left government, it's not the same as some left governments that are not good, but a good left government is better for me. Lula, the thing are crazy. No? Lula was in the Marxist thought very reformist, but he helped the movements. Evo Morales was very radical in the government, but they don't help the movements. It's crazy, no? Then I see that I won't fight against the state. I will defend me from the state, but not fight against. This is the worst way, because I can defeat. Sure, I will defeat. In some moments, I must be hard to defend, but it's different defending to attack. No? And then I think it's like a dance. When you help me, I go with you. But my autonomy is intouchable, intocable. My autonomy is sacred. No? It's like my charge. Then the other things we can discuss. It's no problem. When the autonomy is empowered, is hard, all can be discussed. And I prefer a good government.
Raul, related to the pandemic, the two leading models are the hammer and the dance. And in Cuba and Denmark and so on, they're practicing the dance. Meanwhile, I notice two questions. Maybe we can combine them. Marcus has a question. Charmaine has a question. Marcus, please. Your sound. No, still not here. Sound. No, we no get. So first, Marcus, we first to Charmaine, and then maybe you look at your sound, your microphone in the meantime. Charmaine, please.
Sure. Okay. Raul, thank you so much for a wonderful talk. My question maybe picks up on your response just to Gustavo in the last few minutes. You've written a little bit before about how you see movements also responding to the counterinsurgency of the state. And that, you know, this question of do we work through hegemonic struggle to work with or to organize against the state, or do we work outside of it through autonomy? You know, you've also pointed to ways that counterinsurgency is a force that fundamentally constrains and weakens movements by using movement language, by using progressive language to actually seem like governments are listening to movements and being driven by social movement demands, but so as to create these kinds of appeasements, right? So using the language of agrarian rights or human rights, or even I think today in increasing context, we're seeing states using the language of abolition even, right? So incorporating in some sense radical language in order to defang it or depoliticize it. And so I'm curious if you have thoughts about this kind of pendulum swing that we see between liberal governments that seem to be a little bit better at this counterinsurgent social policy on the one hand, and then the rise of fascist ascendancies that produce much more antagonistic relations to social movements on the other. And whether you think that there's a moment now in the I'm curious if you can tell us a little bit about your thoughts about what the pandemic in particular reveals in terms of this kind of counterinsurgent relationship to social movements.
Yes, we have two forms of counterinsurgency. One form is the military or paramilitary groups or drugs trafficked, because I speak from South America or Latin America, Mexico, Colombia. They learned in Colombia first to use drug traffic against the movements. The chief commander of the police, General Naranjo in Colombia, there was the master of this idea, using traffic against organizations. And then they was confident, they was supporter, worked with Peña Nieto in Mexico, the last government, to translate the Colombian experience to Mexico. And then in Mexico, the drug traffickers began to integrate to the counterinsurgency armed and paramilitary movement, against the peoples. This is one very important work. The other hand is the social politics. The master of the social politics was an American, Mr. Robert McNamara. They learned in Vietnam that I can win a war with arms. Arms has to do, but it's not the important thing. And then create in the World Bank the idea of social politics. And now in Colombia, in the war against the FARC, the guerrillas, the government spent most money in social politics as in the army. And the social politics, what do? They break the organizations. They co-opted the leaders. They make the conditions to the multinationals enterprises to exploit the water, the mining, and so. And then these two parts of the counterinsurgency, the two are very dangerous for the movements. Not only the army hand, the two hands are very, very dangerous. And I see in this way, I will explain, the Zapatistas makes a lot to have hospitals, clinics, schools, and so. Why? Because they see that the government comes with a lot of money and with a lot of services. There are very bad services, but there are services, and they must fight in the health, in the care, in education, and in this way they work a lot, but very and they make, for example, in each there are more than 1,000 communities from the Zapatista, supporting the Zapatista movement. And in each community, you have a music group with the battery, with the electric guitars, and so, and because they need that the youngs don't go to the cities. And I say the struggle is not a struggle. There are a lot of kind of different struggles. No, the army is one, but it's very bad. Good, they can kill you. Good, But the other kinds of counterinsurgency, cultural, psychological, social politics, can break the movements. And this is very, very dangerous for the future from the movements. And then I think what Gustavo questioned, we can make a point between the two. You can use the social politics for you, for the movement, when you said stop. You give me money or resources, and I decided where I can use these resources, but not that you come vertically with the solution. No, no. You must respect the movement power. I don't know, it's okay?
Claro, claro. Gracias. Marcus, is your audio now back on? Oh, we have lost Marcus. Please, Raul, thanks, Charmaine. Are there other
What's the matter with
considerations?
Marcus?
Yeah, he's all the way in Germany, my dear. In Erfurt.
Ah, my God.
Yeah. All right, please. Discussion is open, folks.
I'll jump in. Thank you.
Charlie.
I was reluctant because I came on late, and I'm very sorry, Raul, to have missed your.
How are you, Charles? In a nice place.
Yes. No, I'm not actually there, unfortunately, but it is a nice place. Yes. Good to see you again. I'm sorry I missed I'll listen to the talk afterwards. I wasn't able to get on until the beginning, just toward the end when I saw the Minga. It was great to hear you. I want to pick up on your response to Gustavo and to some extent Charmaine. And part of what you said was that what's going to be crucial is having good leftist governments and not bad leftist governments. And it seems not because the good leftist governments are going to be pro-autonomy, anti-racist, kind of incorporating intersectional justice kind of principles within their governance commitments. And when you think about the pink tide leftist governments, I suppose Lula is a partial exception, although the Black movement would have lots of questions about that. And most of our leftist governments of the pink tide probably end up falling a little bit more in your bad leftist governments category than the other. And I'm just wondering it sounded like you were saying that Arce and the negotiations in Bolivia bode well. I had a sense that the left in Chile, although they lost the elections, they were forging a different kind of relationship with Mapuche than previous left movements have in Chile. Do you see could you talk a little bit more about what these good leftist movements that are trying to claim the state look like, and how are we doing in terms of them building power in this crucial moment?
Yes, it's a good question, but not easy. I think a good left government is a government who speak with the movement and ask, what do you need? And won't co-opt one thing. The problem with the left governments is not only the government, it's also the movement, because there are a lot of movement that they love cooptation. But I think a good left government need also good social organizations, good social movements. And good social movements are autonomous movements. They don't fight for cooptations or for power quote. No, They work for transformation. And then the relationship between these two government and movements will be in the same level, like I said, will be like equals. The cooperation. The government asks, what do you need? I give, what do you need? And the movement said, I won't be a problem for you. This is a nice relationship. Normally, it don't goes. It wasn't this way with Evo Morales, with Correa, and so, and now with López Obrador. No, the idea, but it could be. I said, Lula make better for the movements like Evo Morales or Correa, because they don't go with the police. This is the first one, no? And they don't co-opt the landless movement. The unions, yes, but the landless movement was not co-opted by Lula. The two want this way. And this is very nice. I think Lula comes from the movement, and the landless movement is very hard. It's a movement very empowered in Brazil. Then they dialogue. Lula don't do the agrarian reform, good, but they don't work with the police against the movement. This was black and white, the two things, no? But I think I don't I don't support Lula government, no, but I said it's better than other governments, because they understand that the solution, I have not solution for the movements, good, but I can dialogue, I can play, I can make a table to discuss some things, good. This thing is for me was one of the better movements, government with the movements, Lula's government. It's for me is crazy, because I am not close from Lula. I am closer to Evo, for example. But in relation for the movements, this was good. It's not an abstract thing. It's very concrete.
In dancing, Raul, is perfection on the table, or is it we move as we go along?
I don't know. I think I see that we use Me Too very are very useful to use some categories like hegemony, like Gramsci, I see, or ideas from the European Eurocentric thought. And this is not very useful because the movements, mostly the indigenous movement, are going in another. There are not autonomists. The idea of Negris autonomies is not, they don't work to understand the movements. Then I think we must work to create new concepts and to accept that we don't know a lot. To understand the really path of the movements is not easy. I can't understand today the black movement in Brazil or in Colombia, because there is not a movement. In North Bahia or in Rio are very different. In the favelas or in the quilombos, it's not a movement. Then I found this very difficult to understand.
Zach, do you want to come in, please? Zach and then Esther. Zach, please.
Yeah. So I'm really enjoying this conversation, and I really appreciate this presentation. It's an honor to hear from someone who I've been reading for such a long time, Raul. So something that I've been thinking about, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts on, is this question that we're all talking about the relationship between movements and governments, movements and parties, and how movements can use parties or use state power without being co-opted and without being put in into a passive controlled role. And I've been thinking about the relationship between Zapatista communities and the Zapatista military as another site where, to move beyond just talking about movements and parties, it seems like there are many other places where we see hierarchical structures interacting with autonomous non-hierarchical spaces in a way where the free autonomous spaces able to use cultural technologies to prevent hierarchical roles, hierarchical institutions like the Zapatista military from being a dominant force, from being a dominating force. And I'm wondering if you see that, if you see that elsewhere, where it's not just a question of movements, this broad monolithic thing, the movement, versus this broad monolithic thing, the state or the party. But throughout, what I see is spaces of hierarchical power and spaces of horizontal power, and movements developing a way of checking and controlling hierarchical power, of restraining it through cultural technology. And I'm wondering what you think of that. Does the same dynamic play out in other areas of movements besides just the movement versus the state? I thought I saw a bit of this in your discussion of the Guard as a defense of the movement.
Please,
sorry, please. Please.
I don't understand because the audio is very bad. Can you translate me, George or Jan?
I think Charmaine has a point here. Spaces of hierarchical power and spaces of horizontal power interacting. Zach, does that make sense?
Yeah, beyond just the party versus the movement, even within movements, even within parties, don't we see this as more of a dance, as we've been saying? I love the dance metaphor, but a dance between spaces where power is concentrated in hierarchical forms. But instead of that being necessarily a problem, it seems like in many of these cases where we see the movement succeed, don't we see it succeed when there are cultural technologies in place, traditions, institutions, rules, practices that restrain that hierarchical power, that bring it, that keep hierarchical power from growing?
Esther, do you want to come in before?
Well, I wish I had been able to come in a little bit earlier, but no, not a problem. I was last in line, but what I wanted to say about dance and movement, I mean, we're talking about movement and dance, I think, in a very limited way here, and I think that that there's a richer. Thank you so much for such a wonderful presentation. And I think that what comes out of your description of the, of the movements, of the social movements, and the relationship that Jan was trying to make with dance is partially imagination and improvisation. And I think that there's a big danger in imagining that, institutions and are fixed. And one of the greatest lessons that I think that we can learn from dance and improvisation is that it prepares you for the unexpected and for the unimaginable. And I think that so much of what I can see happening in the peasant movements that are so powerful that you have mapped out is an ability to engage with the the unexpected and the unimaginable fearlessly. And so, and this is not just a political or intellectual experiment. This is something inherited in the dances, in the songs, in the force that that is given to peoples who have experienced devastating oppression. The imaginary and dance is so central, not just as a concept, but actually as a mode of transmitting the desire and the possibility of the unimaginable.
George, do you want to come in too? Sorry, Raul.
Yes, first, that from Zach. Yes, in the movements are a lot of different spaces. The community is more or less a space of, it's horizontal power, I'm not sure, but it's a space with power, but the power is more dispersed. Good. We can say it's more or less the community a space of horizontal power. But the Indian Guard is a space of hierarchical power, but controlled by the communities. Not directly, but indirectly controlled. This is a very large discussion, but I think that I don't agree with Holloway with the anti-power. There don't exist the no power. In every spaces are power. You can play the power in the way that the assembly has more power as the leaders. Also, the assembly, we cannot make a idealization of the community, and in the community assembly there are power. It's not so hard as the leader power. It's separate. The leader is separated from the community, the community, and over the community, on the community. No, these powers are moving normally. But I think the movements needs spaces with hierarchical power to decide some things in minutes. The groups specialized in the defense cannot make assembly in the very difficult, but this hierarchical power must be controlled. And instead place this idea between dance and improvisation. I remember I practiced Tai Chi, this art of Chinese, no? Or in the danza do Shondaro, is a dance from the Brazilian Indians. Also the black people has dances, and the art of this dance is to avoid the knock of the other. Then the movement is to avoid, to move, and I continue the movement, and I must see the other to avoid, to defense. And the defense is not to break the other, not to confront the other, is to avoid, to move in the space. And this is very interesting, no? Now the Zapatistas are beginning in the next year a trip throughout Europe, no? It's like a dance to avoid the knock of the paramilitaries in Chiapas, but in the big space. It's not the revolution. No, I think this terminology, this vocabulary, these words are very hard to understand the things.
George, please.
Yeah, thank you. No, just to build off of Raul's intervention now to Zachary's question. I think this is, for me, why I think I find this framing of what Raul uses as societies in movement incredibly important, because it sort of calls attention and brings attention to this sort of equivocation in understanding or looking at the way different societies, multiple societies, understand the same concept. Right? We're talking about power now, for example, and how power is constituted, how it's thought about, how it's imagined in communities. And I know Raul has done and looked at the work of different indigenous communities that, for example, have rotating leaders or chiefs that follow, but they not lead, right, in the same sort of tradition of the Zapatistas, and similar traditions of Zapatistas. So I think to engage with this question, it's sort of stepping back and understanding that there are multiple these cosmovisions, these different understandings of power and how they relate to that, and what power means and what it does within these different spaces. Yeah.
I don't heard good you. Can you explain a little bit in Spanish or...
¿Cómo usas el concepto de las sociedades de movimiento?
Good.
Eso nos ayuda a entender, yes. ¿No? Entender cómo
yes,
las diferentes sociedades entienden el poder, el concepto del poder. ¿No?
I am changing my ideas. Normally, I use social movement in the same way as Sidney Tarrow and another researchers, European or Americans. After 2001 in South America and mostly in Argentina, I see that the idea of social movements is not nice to understand or to understand the indigenous movement, for example, because in the movement they move heterogenic social relationships. Then there are other societies, or in part other societies. And then I speak about societies in movement. Luis Tapia from Bolivia said societary movements, and Álvaro García Linera in the same way said anything so, because the traditional concept of social movement is not good. And in the last year, I was some weeks in the Andean region in Peru, in Apurímac, and in discussions with the Micaela Bastidas University, mostly young Quechuas, women and men's, youngs, they prefer to speak as peoples in movement, because the Aymara is one people, the Quechua is one people, and so. And I agree with this. It's nice to discuss, to change, to look for other ideas, because our ideas are so strength. They are not useful to understand all. Here is also a question from Ursula. Ursula asked, are any of these autonomous agrarian movements in Latin America today inspired by Maoism? Now, I think not. Perhaps in the 90s in Peru, Sendero Luminoso and so. I think so. But the Mao's experience in the Long March and so, there is important to understand some movements, because the different thing as the European and Soviet social theory, revolutionary theory, is that in China there was liberated zones, no, the red zones. And here in Latin America, we have some territories that are in the same, they are similar as these red zones from China, but I don't found more relations.
Yeah, Ursula left the group now, but very interesting.
Good.
See. Raul, thanks so much for your dancing lessons and lessons in Tai Chi and Qigong. Let's hope in the near future we can dance or do Tai Chi together. Charlie also says that, and many others. What an enjoyable conversation. Marvelous. George, thanks. Raul, thanks. Everybody, marvelous. We should better close up because it's time. Muchas gracias. Hola.
Thank you so much, Raul.
Thanks for you.
Thank you so much.
We are searching new words and new concepts to understand more the reality. This is my way, and I see that some of you are in the same way. Thanks for you. Good dance.
All right.
Gracias, Raúl. Thank you.
All right. Gracias. Gracias.
Ciao.
Bye. All right. Ciao, ciao. All right. All right.